Let's rewind the clock, not by centuries or even millennia, but by a staggering 4.7 million years. The Earth you'd see back then was nothing like today. There were no cities, no fire, no tools, no spoken language. In fact, there were no modern humans at all. Instead, vast forests stretched across much of East Africa. Towering trees provided thick canopy cover, and wide grasslands buzzed with life and death. Herds of primitive elephants and antelopes roamed the plains. Massive crocodiles lurked in rivers. Predators like saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and enormous terror birds ruled the food chain. And somewhere, hiding in the shadows, were our earliest ancestors. One of the first creatures who started the journey to becoming human was called Australopithecus anamensis. Standing around 4 feet tall and covered in hair, they didn't look like us. Their brains were small, about 1/3 the size of ours, and they couldn't speak or make tools. But they could walk upright on 2 legs, and that changed everything. Why is that such a big deal? Because walking on 2 feet, called bipedalism, gave our ancestors a unique advantage. It allowed them to see farther across the grasslands to spot danger. It freed up their hands to carry food, tools, or babies. And it helped them travel long distances, escaping threats or finding new resources. In short, standing up helped them survive. The East African Rift Valley, where many of their fossils have been found, was a harsh and unpredictable place. Some days were scorching hot. Others brought torrential rain. Rivers would flood and dry out. Fruit trees came and went with the seasons. Survival depended on being adaptable, mobile, and constantly alert. Our ancestors didn't have fire to protect them at night. They didn't have clothing. They likely didn't even have shelter beyond trees, tall grass, and maybe a cave when they could find one. They probably slept in the branches of trees, away from predators. Every sound in the dark, a snap of a twig, a distant growl, could mean death. And yet, against all odds, they endured. They were not strong. They weren't fast. They didn't have fangs or claws. What they had was something far more powerful: curiosity, instinct, and the earliest spark of intelligence. They remembered where the fruit grew. They recognized danger signs. They stayed in groups for protection. And little by little, they started becoming more than just another animal. They began the long, incredible journey toward becoming human. This is where our story begins, not with fire or weapons, but with a small, upright walking creature who learned how to survive in a world that wanted it dead. So what was daily life really like for our ancestors 4.7 million years ago? One word: dangerous. Everything was a threat. There were no permanent homes, no cozy fires, no community watch. These early hominins, like Australopithecus anamensis, were small, fragile, and constantly exposed to predators and weather. Their lives were a delicate balance of fear, hunger, and instinct. Let's start with shelter. There were no houses or huts. Early humans hadn't yet learned how to build or shape their environment. Most likely, they slept in trees, just like their primate cousins. Why? Because it was safer. Large predators, like hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and giant snakes, couldn't easily reach them high in the branches. At night, the world became even more dangerous. The darkness hid predators. The temperature dropped. Thunderstorms could roll in with no warning. Imagine being curled up on a branch, clutching your child, listening to growls echo through the jungle, not knowing if you'd survive till morning. That was normal life. And then there was the endless search for food. These early hominins were gatherers. They survived off the land by picking wild fruits, nuts, seeds, berries, and edible roots. Occasionally, they may have eaten insects, bird eggs, or even small animals, but they didn't hunt. They had no weapons, no fire to cook with, no traps. Their diet was mostly plant-based, raw, and seasonal. Food was unpredictable. You couldn't just store it in a basket or fridge. If a tree stopped bearing fruit or a drought dried up the water source, you had to move fast. The ability to remember which trees ripened in which season or where to find certain roots became a matter of life or death. And let's not forget the water problem. Fresh water wasn't always nearby. Rivers and streams changed with the seasons. Drinking from standing water could mean parasites or disease. But the early hominins learned, through observation and instinct, which places were safer. They might have followed animals to watering holes or recognized signs of rain by watching the clouds or the behavior of birds. But the biggest threat wasn't hunger or thirst. It was predators. Imagine being 3 feet tall and weighing 60 pounds. Now imagine sharing your environment with apex killers, giant snakes, lions, crocodiles, and massive birds of prey. You couldn't fight them. You couldn't outrun them. Your only chance was to hide, climb, or stay alert. That's why early humans lived in small groups. Not because they were social, yet, but because there was safety in numbers. More eyes meant more chances of spotting danger. More bodies meant greater intimidation. If one saw danger and made a sound or movement, the rest could escape. It was primitive teamwork, but it worked. This environment also shaped their daily rhythm. Most likely, they rose with the sun and slept shortly after sunset. Midday, when the sun was at its hottest, might have been time to rest. Early morning and late afternoon were key for foraging, when the temperature was more bearable and predators less active. There was no concept of free time. Every action, walking, climbing, resting, was geared toward one goal, staying alive. Now, imagine doing all of this without fire, without tools, without language, and with children to care for. The sheer mental and physical toughness of these early hominins is awe-inspiring. They didn't just survive, they adapted. They learned which foods were poisonous. They remembered which animals were dangerous. They communicated using sounds, gestures, and expressions, the earliest beginnings of nonverbal language. Over generations, this knowledge was passed down, not through storytelling or teaching as we know it, but through mimicry, observation, and instinct. And through all this, they endured. The fact that you're reading this right now, sitting in safety, maybe sipping tea or coffee, means that your ancestors survived this relentless, brutal world. They made it through storms, predators, starvation, and injuries with nothing but their instincts, courage, and the strength of each other. That's not just survival. That's the origin of resilience. Long before humans discovered how to build fire or shape tools, something quietly, almost invisibly, began to change the brain. At 4.7 million years ago, our ancestors' brains were still small, around 350 to 400 cubic centimeters, barely a third the size of modern humans. But size wasn't everything. What mattered most was how those brains began to work. This wasn't a sudden aha moment. It wasn't like one day they woke up and invented language. It was slow, happening over thousands of generations. But it started with something fundamental: awareness. Early hominins, like Australopithecus anamensis, started paying closer attention to the world around them. They noticed patterns, where the juiciest fruit grew, when predators were active, how certain sounds warned of danger. That pattern recognition was the first sign of intelligence. Let's imagine a scene. A small group is walking near a water source. One individual hears rustling. Most would flee, but one stops. They remember hearing that sound before, right before a predator attacked. That second of hesitation, that moment of recall, could mean the difference between life and death, not just for them, but for their whole group. That's the power of early intelligence. It wasn't about inventing things yet. It was about noticing, remembering, and adjusting. And with this awareness came something new: planning. Instead of simply reacting, early humans began to anticipate. They might have stored fruit in tree hollows or remembered the migration paths of animals. They could recognize that certain plants would return after rain, or that staying in one area too long could attract predators. These tiny decisions added up to something profound: strategic thinking. And then there was the beginning of problem solving. Imagine trying to crack open a nut with your teeth. Painful, right? Now imagine watching another group member using a stone to smash it. Suddenly, that stone becomes valuable, not just as a thing, but as a tool. This is where tool use likely began, not with crafting, but with repurposing. Sticks to dig up roots, rocks to crack bones, sharp-edged stones to cut into fruit or scrape bark. No one was knapping flint or shaping spears yet. That would come millions of years later. But this early tool use showed one critical skill: learning through observation. If one individual discovered something useful, others copied it. This created the first form of knowledge sharing, not through teaching, but through imitation. That leads us to another spark of intelligence: empathy. To learn from others, you must pay attention. You must recognize what others are doing, and even understand their intent. When a mother fed her child certain berries and avoided others, the young observed. When someone in the group got hurt, others responded with concern, offering leaves to soothe the wound or helping them walk. That basic understanding of others' experiences, that's empathy. And it's uniquely human. From empathy came connection, and from connection came communication. These early humans couldn't speak like we do today, but they began developing a kind of proto-language. Facial expressions to signal fear or approval. Grunts and calls to alert danger. Gestures to share ideas, like pointing or miming an action. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't philosophy. But it was the beginning of language. And once our ancestors started communicating, everything changed. They could warn others before danger arrived. They could share knowledge across generations. They could work together to solve problems, not just as individuals, but as a thinking group. That's the real birth of humanity. It didn't begin with tools or fire. It began when our ancestors started thinking beyond themselves. When they remembered. When they planned. When they connected. That mental spark is what separates us from every other creature. It's not our strength or speed or claws or fangs. It's the mind, the slow-burning, ever-evolving fire that allowed us to adapt, survive, and eventually transform the planet. So next time you solve a problem, remember this. The very first time someone figured out how to survive using their brain was 4.7 million years ago. If there's one reason humans still exist today, it's this. We learned to survive together. At 4.7 million years ago, the world was cruel and relentless. Early hominins, like Australopithecus anamensis, weren't the strongest, fastest, or fiercest creatures around. They didn't have claws or sharp teeth. They didn't build shelters or weapons. What they had was each other. And that changed the game. Imagine being one of these early ancestors. You're small, maybe the size of a 10-year-old today, and constantly hunted by predators. You live in a group of 10 to 15 individuals. Some are old, some are infants. Most are adults doing the same thing you're doing, trying to make it through one more day. Your survival depends on watching, listening, and most importantly, working together. These early humans likely organized themselves around family units or loose social groups, not unlike modern primates. There was no government, no roles or titles, just instinctive cooperation. If someone saw danger, they didn't keep it to themselves. They sounded the alarm, maybe with a grunt, a hand wave, or a sudden movement. That instinct to alert others, to protect the group rather than just themselves, was one of the first signs of social intelligence. And the benefits were enormous. If one person climbed a tree and found fruit, they might lead the others there. If one adult was injured, others might stay behind to help. If predators came, the group scattered together, confusing the attacker and saving more lives. This early form of cooperation was survival through unity. But it didn't stop at reacting to threats. Over time, these groups started to develop more complex behaviors that shaped the future of human life. Take parenting, for example. Among most animals, only mothers care for their young, and even that's often brief. But among early humans, there's evidence that alloparenting may have occurred, meaning others help care for the babies, not just the biological mother. Why? Because babies took time to grow. They were vulnerable for years, not weeks. If a group didn't support its young, it didn't survive. Helping care for someone else's child may seem simple, but it required trust and long-term thinking. That trust became the foundation of social bonding, something no other species developed quite like we did. Then came sharing. Food sharing may have started with necessity. If one individual had more than they could eat, they might drop a piece, or a child might cry, and someone handed them a root. But these small, seemingly random moments eventually led to structured behavior. Help me today, and I'll help you tomorrow. It's the beginning of reciprocity, a system that would eventually become the foundation of economics, morality, and even law. Of course, there was no spoken language yet. But early humans communicated through gestures, body language, tone, and repetition. A raised hand could mean danger. A repeated grunt might mean follow me. Over generations, this created a proto-language that helped coordinate group activity. Hunting, gathering, moving, or warning. Another remarkable trait from this period was emotional intelligence. To survive together, you need to understand each other's feelings. If someone is afraid, hungry, or hurt, the group needs to recognize that and respond. This required reading expressions, empathizing, and reacting with compassion, a rare trait in the animal kingdom. These early hominins may have even grieved their dead. Fossils show evidence of individuals who lived for years with injuries. Injuries they could not have survived alone. Someone helped them, protected them, fed them. That is empathy, and it's what would eventually define our humanity. Working together wasn't just useful, it was evolutionary power. The groups that bonded survived longer. They raised healthier children. They passed on knowledge. They warned each other. And slowly, they began shaping their own environment. The predator-prey equation started to shift. Instead of being easy targets, early humans became more resilient, observant, and defensive. With cooperation came confidence. With confidence came exploration. And with exploration came the first steps toward civilization. So while fire tools and language would take millions more years to evolve, the most powerful weapon of all had already formed. It's what helped them stay alive back then. And it's what still keeps us alive today. Here is the fully expanded Section 5. Legacy of the Forgotten World, at approximately 500 to 700 words, closing out the story in a powerful and YouTube-friendly style. Hook before fire. Before words. Before history, there was survival. And it changed everything. When we think of human history, we often start with kings and empires. With pyramids, cities, and wars. But the real beginning, the one that made all of that possible, happened long before we ever wrote a word. 4.7 million years ago, the earliest members of our evolutionary family faced a world that was raw, wild, and unforgiving. And yet, somehow they endured. They had no civilization, no technology, no stories or songs passed down in books. But they did something even more extraordinary. They survived. Let's think about what that actually means. Every time a child was born, the group had to protect it for years before it could even walk on its own. Food was unpredictable. Water could vanish overnight. The smallest wound could mean infection and death. A single predator could wipe out an entire family. But still life found a way. And not just any life, the life that would eventually become us. These early ancestors didn't rule the world. They lived with it, adapting to the forests, the rivers, the predators. They didn't try to control nature. They learned how to listen to it, how to move with the seasons, how to balance fear and curiosity. And from that balance came knowledge, knowledge that wasn't written, but lived. Think of it like a chain. Each generation passed on behaviors and memories. Where to find food, what dangers to avoid, who could be trusted, how to raise children, when to move and when to stay still. All of this was passed not through words, but through experience, through the eyes and hands of one generation to the next. That chain never broke. Even today, in your own family, you are still connected to that chain. It's in the way your brain works, the way your body reacts to danger, and the way your emotions respond to others. Why do we instinctively look after babies? Why do we panic when we're alone in the dark? Why do we bond in groups, create stories, and form communities? Because we've been doing it for millions of years. Even though the world has changed, cities instead of forests, smartphones instead of sharp stones, the instincts, habits, and survival strategies of those ancient ancestors still live inside us. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of all is this. They were the first to prove that you don't need power or weapons to survive. You need adaptability. You need awareness. You need each other. From that simple beginning, a few small groups walking upright, avoiding predators, sharing food, and caring for their young, came every invention, every language, every piece of human culture that exists today. We owe everything, to the nameless, wordless ancestors who lived, struggled, and endured for 0.7 million years ago. They didn't leave behind temples or gold or monuments. They left behind us. So the next time you look at your reflection, remember, you're not just a modern human living in the 21st century. You're the result of an ancient, unbroken chain of survival, started by beings who lived in trees, walked on two legs, and dared to face a world full of danger with nothing but their instincts and each other. That is your true origin story. Not just human history, but human resilience.